Idaho State Capitol building sits at the end of Capitol Boulevard, a street dedicated to beauty and government functions. The street provides a view straight to the Capitol building starting at the Boise train depot. In an article entitled Creating Boise's Capitol Boulevard by J.M. Neal, the author describes how supporters of the creation of Capitol Boulevard in 1922 argued that the view from the Boise train depot would, quote, give visitors the best possible impression of Boise, end quote. By having it directly connected to the train depot, the way that most travelers entered Boise at the time the street was created, it showed that citizens take pride in the building and the services it provides. The street is lined by stunning parks and museums. This grand scene leading up to the building itself highlights the importance of the things that take place there. It acts as a welcoming path to an important meeting place for political change, whether that be by ordinary people or elected officials. The architecture of the building itself is very unique and detailed. There is nothing else quite like the giant dome and white pillars in the Boise skyline. This style of architecture is common in Capitol buildings around the country and has become known as a symbol of government. The grandiosity of the architecture shows the significance of the things that happen there. This is a place where government action is taken, but more importantly, this is a place where people can voice their concerns about the decisions elected officials are taking through protest. This is an important building that invites citizens to take actions on the issues they care about most.
You've likely heard it referred to as the People's House, and unlike other state houses across the country, people can just kind of walk into it, usually any day of the week.
The United States Constitution gives people the right to assemble and protest the government, and that is a right that we should be actively using. The openness of the Idaho State Capitol building is inviting us to use our voices and advocate for the changes that we see are needed. Protests have been happening there since its creation, organized by groups of people from all political parties and covering a variety of topics. One notable protest that occurred at the Idaho State Capitol building in the past was a civil rights protest that took place in 1968. Although it happened many years ago, the rhetoric used by protesters and the rhetoric that surrounded the protest is very similar to many of the protests that happen today. In an article from an edition of the Idaho Statesman in 1968, the author describes how protesters had great passion and took a lot of pride in what they were doing. Just like today, the majority of protesters were young people, and many were students at Boise State at the time. The rhetorical choices used by protesters to convey their message was not too far off the way that people do now. There was laughter and songs that were sung. This shows that even though the protesters are taking it seriously, they are a community and welcoming change. Protesters today also often create that sense of community through rallying speeches and chants. In the aftermath of the protests that occurred in 1968, there was a lot of backlash from the opposing side. They said that a, quote, communist fire team has formed a conspiracy, starting fires in a rural Burley and remote Nampa, Idaho. This is very similar to the rhetoric surrounding protests about topics like Black Lives Matter or police brutality today. The opposition describes protesters as rioters, Antifa, and again, communists. They do this in order to diminish the protesters' message. In present day, some of the most prominent protests happening at the State House surround mask mandates, people against vaccination, and the debate surrounding whether or not children are being indoctrinated by teachers through critical race theory.
Here, Fire, you're hungry? Here, here's another mask.
The protests against mask mandates and vaccinations have some similarities to other protests. For example, speeches and chants to rally the crowds.
We the people! Who has the power to change legislation? We the people!
This shows that although people at these different protests are often on opposing sides, they still make some of the same rhetorical choices to spread their message. They do have a few key differences from the other protests discussed, though. First, the demographic is very different. Many of the previously mentioned protests were made up mostly by high school and college students. As shown in the photos of these events, protests against masks and vaccines were mostly older than that, as well as the children of the attendees. They also had some differences in the nonverbal rhetoric they displayed. While both protests were peaceful, some of the ones against vaccines and masks were armed, while the ones previously mentioned were not. This demonstrates their approach to protesting and the message they want to put out. By bringing weapons to a protest, they are showing a much more aggressive and assertive message. Their tactics are meant to instill fear in order to make change, rather than large, persistent demonstrations.
Eliminate academic freedom under the name of indoctrination that does not even exist. As students, this greatly affects us because we will no longer be taught the true history of our country.
House Bill 377 also sparked a protest that had great similarities and differences to many of the other protests mentioned before. It was a protest surrounding the debate of whether or not children were being indoctrinated by teachers teaching critical race theory and, in turn, attempting to ban the teaching of certain topics out of fear that would place blame on certain groups for the hardship of minority groups. As shown in photos of this protest, we can see that the small protest was made up almost entirely by students aged from middle school to college, which fits with the trend of young people being the most active at protests. By the population of that protest being so young, they are making a statement. The bill in question is one that directly affects specifically their age, and by being there, they are communicating that the wants of the group being affected are different than the ones making decisions for them. This protest also had the rhetoric of speeches that verbally stated their message and got the crowd excited. Other than those speeches, though, the protest was very quiet. They had signs that concisely stated their messages that did the talking for them. By staying silent, they showed a strong, unified team and displayed confidence in their argument without the need for chanting or fighting. This also shows how articulate these young people are because they do not feel the need to yell to be heard. The nonverbal rhetoric of just being there for the bill being read sends the message they needed.
A building built for the people, by the people of the Gem State.
Protests past and present use many different types of rhetoric, from loud chants and speeches to excite a crowd and form a community, to silent protests that are all about sharing a message. There are protests with strategies to get people to join the movement because there is strength in numbers, as well as attempting to instill fear into people with opposing viewpoints through bringing weapons or aggression. The rhetorical strategies of protesters overall have stayed consistent over the past decades. The issues being talked about may have evolved or changed, but the Capitol building itself is still meeting its goal, inspiring government work and political change. The Capitol building is a beautiful building full of history of people advocating for human rights and what they feel is best for the community. It is open to us, and we are lucky enough to have the right to assemble and protest the government. And that is something that we, as citizens of Idaho, should not take lightly. If you hear about a political demonstration that matches your ideologies and the rhetoric you feel needs to be put out there, I challenge you to go and make your voice heard and take advantage of this location designed for the people. There is no better place to do so. When you are there, think of the rhetoric you're using, and think of what this building is saying to you as you protest. When there is injustice all around us, we must go and advocate for the change we want to see in the world.